The Apostle Paul says the good that he wants to do, he does not do. He does just the opposite of what he wants to do. What is he talking about? Greetings, I'm David Brett, here with John Fisher, bringing you Revealing the Truth. Today we want to talk about something Paul stated about not doing the good that he wants to do, but the very evil that he doesn't want to do, that he does. And we need to understand this in context of what he's talking about, because he says that he is blameless, and that according to the law, he did it. And he couldn't really be accused, and he did his utmost to have a blameless conscience towards Yahweh, towards his fellow man, because he said that he didn't even break Caesar's law, and this you can look up for yourself in Acts chapter 24. Let's look at Romans 8 and verse 7. It says, "The mind set on the flesh is hostile towards Yahweh, for it does not subject itself to the law of Yahweh, for it is not even able to do so." Now, we understand that the law of Yahweh is good, but Paul is saying that he does what is evil, and this is hard to understand. And even the Apostle Peter said that some take his words and twist them like they do the rest of the Scriptures to justify their lawlessness. But we have to go a little bit deeper to understand this, what he's talking about here. In verse 16, he says of Romans 7, in verse 16, says, "If I do the very thing I do not want to do, I agree with the law, confessing that the law is good. So now, no longer am I the one doing it, but sin which dwells in me. For I know that nothing good dwells in me, that is in my flesh." So he's clarifying himself. He's not saying that what's really inside him is not good. He's saying the flesh, this aspect of who we are, and we are all flesh. He says that he sees the evil. And the good, though, is within him, because we know that the Spirit of Yahweh is good. And we receive a portion of that, and he had a good portion of that in his ministry as he went forth and taught. But we, with the Spirit, are to discern spiritual things. Spiritual things are discerned by the Spirit. Verse 19, it goes on to say that, "For the good that I want to do, I do not do, but I practice the very evil I do not want to do." Verse 20, "But if I am doing the very thing I do not want, I am no longer the one doing it, but sin which dwells in me. I find then the principle that evil is present in me, the one who wants to do good, for I joyfully concur with the law of Yahweh in the inner man. But I see a different law in the members of my body, waging war against the law of my mind, and making me a prisoner of the law of sin which is in my members. Wretched man that I am, who will set me free from this body of death?" The conflict that the Apostle Paul was having was because he had Yahweh's Spirit, and he wanted to submit to that Spirit, and in fact he did, according to the law. He is blameless. Now, how do we understand this then? Well, let's look at what 1 Corinthians 2 and verse 14 starts out saying. It says, "A natural man does not accept the things of the Spirit of Yahweh, for they are foolishness to him, and he cannot understand them, because they are spiritually appraised or understood. But he who is spiritual appraises all things, yet he himself is appraised by no one. For who has known the mind of Yahweh, that he will instruct him? But we have the mind of Messiah." So what Paul is saying is that we can understand spiritual things. In fact, we put on spiritual glasses when we receive of Yahweh's Spirit. But there's still the flesh that we are in the sense that we still are physical. Now, does this mean we spiritualize everything away and do our own thing? Absolutely not. We are to be obedient to the law, as Paul often would point out. He says, do we do we, does our faith, do away with the works? Absolutely not. And so we are to have a proper attitude. He speaks about fleshly things. In verse 3 of 1 Corinthians 3, says, "You are still fleshly, for since there is jealousy and strife among you, are you not fleshly, and are you not walking like mere men?" This starts to get into a better understanding. I mean, we look at the flesh and we see characteristics of the flesh. We look at the Spirit and we see characteristics of the Spirit, not only walking in the instructions as the Messiah did, but having the right attitude like the Messiah did. Now, we are not able to tell people that they're devils and that they're lying, and we can discern certain things, but we can't condemn anyone. Now, Yahshua said, certain people were heading towards the lake of fire, essentially. Well, he had that right to tell them that and to tell them how their hearts were, because he knew, having the fullness of Yahweh's Spirit, he could discern fully. We're given a portion, so it works with us, and we understand that we still have the flesh, and the struggle is within to overcome the flesh with the Spirit. So Paul, in Romans 6 through 9, roughly you have, or 6 through 8 rather, you have this concept of the flesh versus the Spirit. It's almost like a chapter in itself on this topic. But he says to walk in the Spirit. Verse 4 of chapter 8, walk, going down, walk. Well, let me just go ahead and read the whole. It says, "So that the requirement of the law might be fulfilled in us who do not walk according to the flesh, but according to the Spirit." Well, if we are walking according to the Spirit, we are going to be right in line with the law. In verse 14 of Romans 7, it says, "For we know that the law is spiritual, but I am of the flesh, sold into bondage of sin." We have this tendency to do wrong. At times, Paul's attitude was not always the best. We could go to Acts chapter 15, for example, and see what kind of struggle he had. Acts chapter 15 and verse 38, for example, we find that he is dealing with Peter and has a dispute concerning John Mark, or Mark, who is also called John, and John, who is also called Mark. We find that it's interesting to see that he was referred to as both. But in verse 39 of 15, it says, well, let's back up to 38. "Paul kept insisting that they should not take him along who had deserted them in Pamphylia and had not gone with him to the work." He had hard feelings against Mark. Mm-hmm. And this is Mark who actually authored the book of Mark. Verse 39, "And there occurred such a sharp disagreement that they separated from one another. And Barnabas took Mark," it was Barnabas, not Peter. "Barnabas took Mark and him and sailed away to Cyprus." The Jerusalem Bible, which is a good scholarship in there concerning the word, it says that the sharp disagreement was literally a violent quarrel. Now, we are not to quarrel with one another. Even the Apostle Paul says we're to be loving. If we don't have love, then we're like a clanging cymbal. So he understood, but he struggled. He struggled with his own attitude. And this was an attitude that affected his action. So the very thing that he wanted to do, he didn't do because the flesh was a part of his life. And so we see this in a part of his life.
There are people who really condemn Paul in this confession that he makes. What I want to do, I don't do, and what I don't want to do, that's what I find myself doing. He's condemned because he's confessing that he is of the flesh in his everyday life. But in his mind, he has the law of Yahweh within him. I think that this can be kind of clarified when we look at Hebrews 10:26 that says, if a man sins willfully after having received the knowledge of the truth, there no longer remains a sacrifice for sins. This idea of willful transgression against the law of Yahweh is what condemns a person. We are all in the flesh. We all make mistakes. We all think anger. We all have anger against our brothers. And Yahshua said that's equivalent to murdering your brother. And so Paul is demonstrating the nature that we all have. We're descendants of Adam who sinned and are descendants of him. So we're born in sin. And Paul is not saying that he is a practicing sinner. He's saying that he is of the flesh like we all are. And so people who condemn him are really simply just not liking what he's saying, I suppose. But there's no justification for excluding what he has written in the Scripture.
Right. We have to look at it with the understanding of what the flesh is really, and what the Spirit of Yahweh is like, and what the character of Yahweh is like. We find that the Apostle Paul, after that great debate and struggle that he had there with Barnabas, he evidently is okay afterwards. He spends time reflecting, evidently, and says in 1 Corinthians 9 and 6, it says, do only Barnabas and I have the right to refrain from working? And he's speaking to others there. So he lifts Barnabas up. He also does the same for Mark in Colossians 4:10, also Philippians 24, and 2 Timothy 4 and verse 11. So we find that there's evidence for what Paul went through and some of the struggles that he had. And even in Galatians 5 and verse 12, we find Paul dealing in Galatians with those that wanted to teach circumcision, physical circumcision. And the Apostle Paul, getting so upset with them, says in verse 12 of chapter 5, he says, I wish those who are troubling you would even mutilate themselves. Or what he's saying there in what we find in the Greek, it's almost as if he's telling them to go ahead and cut the whole thing off. And I think we all know what thing he's talking about. Did he really mean that? Or was his anger, flaring up from his flesh and causing him to say something like that maybe, I don't know if he meant for this letter to be read. It's, we have these in chapters today. There's 6 chapters in Galatians. But, it is read today, and we kind of understand that Paul maybe shouldn't have said that because the Messiah, and this gets into the Anti-Pauline teachers who will point out, well, there's here's the Messiah's attitude and here's Paul's attitude. What's going on? Well, Paul himself said he struggled, and he admitted that the things that he wanted to do, he didn't do. The things that he didn't want to do, those are the very things he did. But I think it gets into these type of things, the attitude, jealousy, strife, anger, these type of things.
Did you know that the words immortal and soul are never found together in the Bible? Did you know that the Bible teaches that the soul that sins will die? The fact is, the idea of an immortal soul is man's idea. The Bible, however, does teach of a resurrection from the dead. To learn more, request your free mini-study, Do You Have an Immortal Soul? Write to YAIY, 2963 County Road 233, Kingdom City, Missouri 65262, or visit us online at yaiy.org. You may also call us toll-free 1-877-642-4101.
The Apostle Paul is hard to understand, but if we have a good understanding of Scripture in general, we can understand Paul's writings. In fact, we can understand with Yahweh's Spirit the deeper things of Paul's writings. As we look in Paul's writings, we find an interesting statement which seems to contradict what we've already been taking a look at. Ephesians 6 and verse 12. It says, "For our struggle is not against the flesh and blood, but against the rulers, against the powers, against the world forces, against the darkness, against the spiritual forces of wickedness in heavenly places." So how do we understand this? Is Paul confused? Or are the Anti-Pauline teachers correct that the Apostle Paul was a heretic? I don't think so. I think we can understand what Paul is saying here when we understand that how the influence of Satan affects the flesh. In Ephesians 2 and verse 2, it says, well, let's back up into verse 1 of chapter 2. "And you were dead in your trespasses and sins, in which you formerly walked according to the course of this world, according to the prince and the power of the air, of the spirit that is now working in the sons of disobedience." You know, last episode we talked about Israel and how in Hebrews, towards the end of chapter 3, they were disobedient. They were sinning. Why? Because they had no belief. We are to have belief, but it is not to be just a shallow belief, because even the demons believe and shudder. So they understand. We are to understand as well that Yahweh is to be respected and honored and obeyed. You cannot have true belief without honoring and obeying Yahweh. So we are to have works with our faith, as James said. Mm-hmm. And so we know that Satan is behind the scenes, and we look at areas of Scripture where, you know, the King David, who was a man after Yahweh's own heart. In fact, he had the Spirit at that time. He's one of the few that was provided Yahweh's Spirit to work with him. But he struggled, and he did things that he shouldn't have done, and he paid the price. I mean, the sword never left his home after he had sinned against Yahweh. So there's punishment that was dealt out. He also got punishment after he submitted to his flesh, which Satan influenced when he counted Israel. He thought, you know, and Satan must have seen it, I'm going to address this pride issue that David had. And 70,000 died because of that. Now, it may seem harsh, but there are lessons in Scripture, just as Hebrews 3 Hebrews 3 and also chapter 4 of Hebrews brings out, that we're not to follow in the footsteps of their bad example, of their unbelief, of their disobedience, but we are in fact to be obedient children. And this is the idea, obedient children rather than disobedient children who follow the flesh. But Paul understood much more than I think many of us understand, and he struggled within himself because he recognized the Spirit within him. And he acknowledged that he obeyed the law of Yahweh, but the depth of understanding that he had was that there were weightier matters of the law, just as Yahshua pointed out that we are to have. And Yahshua had the fullness of the Spirit, so he walked accordingly and correctly and exactly as Yahweh wanted him to. And the Apostle Paul admitted we are to follow in the Messiah's footsteps. We are to follow him as he followed Yahweh. And so ultimately we follow Yahweh through the Messiah. But let's go back into Matthew a ways. I want to point out another example where Satan's influence affects the flesh. Matthew 16 and verse 13. Now Yahshua came into the district of Caesarea Philippi. He was asking his disciples, "Who do people say that the Son of Man is?" And they said, some say John the Baptist, others say Elijah, still others say Jeremiah or one of the prophets. Verse 15 says, "But he said to them, 'But who do you say that I am?' And Simon Peter answered, 'You are the Messiah, the Son of the living Elohim.'" Verse 17 says, "And Yahshua said to him, 'Blessed are you, Simon Bar-Jonah, because flesh and blood did not reveal this to you, but my Father who is in heaven.'" So he acknowledged Yahweh's Spirit working with Peter to help him to understand. But then he turns around and says in verse 21, from that time Yahshua began to show his disciples that he must go to Jerusalem and suffer many things from the elders and the chief priests, scribes, and be killed and raised up on the third day. Verse 22, Peter took him aside and began to rebuke him, saying, Yahweh forbid it, Master, this shall never happen to you. Is that coming from his spirit, from Yahweh's spirit, or from the flesh? Well, listen here, verse 23. But he turned around and said to Peter, Get behind me, Satan, for you are a stumbling block to me. For you are not setting your mind on Yahweh's interest, but man's. Now, Satan is involved here, obviously, because he spoke to Peter, but he's also speaking to the spirit that was affecting Peter's flesh. And this is something that the Apostle Paul understood. And that's why he refers to it as evil. The natural man submits to Satan because of the flesh, because of the influence that's around the world right now. Mm-hmm. And it is a strong, deceiving influence. And it's allowed because Yahweh is working things out to the way he's going to have things end up. But this is something that we find, and we are to be aware of it, not to be unaware. He points out that we are to even suffer with the Messiah, to be raised up with him. Verse 17 of Romans 8, and if children, heirs also heirs of Yahweh, and fellow heirs with Messiah, if indeed we suffer with him, so that we may also be glorified with him. Part of the suffering is dealing with the flesh. Yahshua did deal with the flesh. In the Garden of Gethsemane, I think that's how it's pronounced, he submitted to Yahweh, but not without struggle. He struggled to the point of, drops of blood, and it's described in science that actually does happen, or can happen. So we have another confirmation that Scripture and the New Testament letters that we have are accurate.
Yeah. Well, he prayed that that cup of what he had to go through would be taken from him, but not receiving an answer, he submitted to Yahweh in what he was bound to do for us.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. So we find that we need to understand Paul's situation, and I think a lot of people do not understand it because they didn't have the amount of spirit that he had and was struggling with. But he told those in Corinth and those in other areas that they were dealing with their flesh and that they needed to overcome, just as he was overcoming, just as he was following the Master's footsteps, just as he submitted to Yahweh's laws. In fact, let's look at Acts chapter 24, because I mentioned there that he was being obedient to Yahweh. He admitted that he was, as much as possible, keeping a clean conscience. Verse 16 of Acts 24, I also do my best to maintain always a blameless conscience, both before Yahweh and before men. And in verse 14, this I admit to you, that according to the way which they call a sect, I do serve the Elohim of our fathers, believing everything that is in accordance with the law and that is written in the prophets. And of course, many of these things pointed to the Messiah. In the last episode, we talked about that. Even the temple itself and the things associated with the physical temple are associated with the Messiah. The red heifer, for example, which is, the ashes were taken in and it purified the people. Well, ultimately, atonement, which we see is prophetically going to be fulfilled through the Messiah, will ultimately be purifying not only the temple and the kingdom at that time, but also the people, I think, is a part of the atoning process. But there are some things that are that could be spoken of that is probably a little bit more deeper than our...
Yeah. Well, the blood sprinkled on the right side of the mercy seat speaks of the Messiah.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, it's just mind-boggling how much is pointed to the Messiah because Yahweh knew the end from the beginning. And so we find Messiah throughout Scripture, or allusions to Messiah, prophecies being fulfilled in Messiah. And, it's a good thing. Acts chapter 25, Paul also says, in his own defense, he says, I have committed no offense either against the law of the Jews or against the temple or against Caesar. So there's really three types of laws mentioned here. Now it's true that nomos is used in the Greek here rather than dogma, but he's talking about not giving an offense, and I think nomos can probably relate still to, it's kind of like the word artos, it can mean unleavened bread or leavened bread. In this sense, I think because it's mentioned the law of the Jews, it's referring to their Pharisaical laws, because the laws against temple, that would be different than their laws. And in Matthew, the Messiah says concerning their laws, their traditions, don't do what they say, but do what they teach from Moses' seat, knowing that they're teaching out of the law. So Messiah, the Apostle Paul, the other apostles, they all confirm that we are to be obedient to Yahweh. But there is a deeper level here in Romans 6, 7, and 8, talking about the flesh versus the spirit. Obviously, we are not to sin. We cannot go on sinning. If we go on sinning, then we have death that awaits us. In fact, it says in verse 13 of chapter 8, if you are living according to the flesh, you must die. But if by the Spirit you are putting to death the deeds of the body, you will live. And it goes on to say, verse 14, all who are being led by the Spirit of Yahweh, these are the sons of Elohim. These are his children. And as we follow his Spirit, as we overcome the flesh, and this is a process, we find this in Revelation 2 and 3, that it's those that overcome within the assemblies that will be able to even sit in the throne, or the seat, or the throne of Yahshua. You can look at this for yourself. The Philadelphia assembly is given this as a promise for them that overcome.
Right. And each of the words that Yahshua is speaking to John in Revelation pertain to the seven assemblies. He's speaking of the works that they do. I know your works.
And Paul says in verse 21, verse 21 of Romans 7, I find then the principle that evil is present in me, the one who wants to do good. I joyfully concur with the law of Yahweh in the inner man. So he's acknowledging the flesh, but he's also acknowledging Yahweh's law and that he's going to follow it, and in the Spirit.